It's a big win for protesters in Hong Kong. The government has suspended a proposed law on extradition to mainland China. Remember, this bill had sparked widespread anger and violent protests over the past few days. Everyone in Hong Kong was waiting with bated breath for this particular announcement. A big proponent of that bill, Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam, admitted that there were inadequacies in the bill. To restore peace and harmony, Lam said that the views of society and lawmakers will be incorporated, adding that the government has taken the decision taking into account the prevailing violence and protests.
To pass the bill in this legislative year is perhaps no longer there. After our repeated internal deliberations over the last 2 days, I now announce that the government has decided to suspend the legislative amendment exercise, restart our communication with all sectors of society, do more explanation work, and listen to different views of society. I want to stress that the government is adopting an open mind to heed comprehensively different views in society towards the bill.
But the opposition leaders have refused to retreat if the controversial extradition bill is not withdrawn.
If she refuses to withdraw, to scrap this controversial bill altogether, it would mean we wouldn't retreat. She stays on, we stay on, because her so-called the commitment here, it's completely lacking in sincerity.
So why exactly was this bill so controversial? Opponents say that China's justice system is marred by torture and forced confessions, arbitrary detention and poor access to lawyers. The extradition bill, if made into a law, was expected to cover Hong Kong's 7 million residents. The bill has many concerned in Hong Kong that it will allow residents to be sent to China for trial and that China could use this law to target political opponents. The bill could also be seen as a threat to Hong Kong's semi-autonomous status, according to its protesters. Hong Kong's top leader, Carrie Lam, has backed the law, though. She cited that human rights will be protected by the city's court, which will decide on a case-by-case basis extraditions. But in her statement, Lam today blamed herself for a failure to communicate this fact effectively to the public. She said that the original driving force of the bill was a murder case in Taiwan, which had loopholes.
As a responsible government, I feel obliged to find a way to deal with the Taiwan murder case so that justice can be done for the deceased, her parents, and society, while at the same time address the deficiencies in our system so that Hong Kong will not become a place for criminals to evade legal responsibility. These are the two original purposes of the government in putting forward the legislative proposal to amend the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance and the Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Ordinance.
Protesters have vowed to fight the extradition bill tooth and nail. Last Wednesday, protesters faced off with police during a mass protest in Hong Kong. Tens of thousands surrounded the city's government headquarters, forcing legislators to postpone a debate on the bill. On Sunday last, that is June 9th, more than 1 million people reportedly took to the streets in a peaceful march against the legislation. It was a huge show of strength considering the number of protesters was equal to 1/7 of the total population of Hong Kong. And joining me on the broadcast this evening is international and independent strategist Andrew K.P. Leung. He's live with us from Hong Kong itself. Andrew, good evening. Thanks very much for joining us this evening on the broadcast. Do you think that this climb down from Carrie Lam should have come earlier, before the bad press that Hong Kong has gotten over the demonstrations and what happened on Wednesday?
Well, I think it was the result of somewhat a misjudgment of the extent of opposition against the bill. Don't forget that it's not the first time the Hong Kong government introduced controversial bills or initiatives. The last one, for example, was the co-location, so-called co-location arrangement, whereby the checkpoints for the high-speed rail located in Hong Kong would house law enforcement officers from the mainland, so that the checking for customs checking can be done at the same time. And that proposal triggered a tremendous kind of opposition across the whole society. There were also demonstrations, there were also protests, but not on this scale. And then a lesson learned from the government was that, well, there are always controversials, and after all, the joint checkpoint proposal eventually passed through, and nothing adverse has happened, and the Hong Kong people are enjoying the high-speed rail, and then they're not going to be abducted by the law enforcement officers from the mainland operating on Hong Kong's checkpoints. So all these worries are superfluous. But this time around, it's very different, because this is a bill that allows the first time for people in Hong Kong, including even foreigners, to be extradited for trial on the mainland. And of course, very few people trust the law across the border.
Right, and 2014 also saw some huge protests. Andrew, what, according to you, set this one apart? How exactly did people gather in such huge numbers? We're given to believe that nearly 1 million people took to the streets on Sunday, that the business community has also supported this protest. Was that one of the main reasons why Hong Kong and China, by extension, were concerned by the visuals that we got to see on our screens this past week?
Well, naturally, the Hong Kong government and also Beijing are really taken aback by this kind of tsunami of protests, and obviously it suggests that not enough have been done to explain the purpose of the bill, and in fact the indecent haste, as it were, to rush the bill through the Legislative Council raises a lot of suspicions, and then of course tally with the concern for a long time that somehow the one country, two systems, all the safeguards are being eroded over the years. I mean, you mentioned there was another mass protest when a number of years ago when Hong Kong tried to introduce the national security law, which is called Article 23. Now, Article 23, in fact, is a requirement in Hong Kong's constitution. But over the years, this particular safeguard for the one country has not been enacted. But the proposal to the initiative to introduce this bill was again trigger a massive backlash, resulting in the dropping of this initiative and indeed the resignation of the former Secretary for Security, and also the early demise of the former I think Dong Jiwa's administration. But this time around it's even more serious, because it's not Article 23, it only refers to crimes in Hong Kong,
right,
and that has trials in Hong Kong. But here, this is the law about trial on the other side of the border.
Indeed. Last question for you, Andrew, this evening. How exactly do you think Beijing is viewing the climb down on the part of Carrie Lam? Does it come as a relief ahead of the G20 summit? I'm sure China wanted to avoid any sort of bad press and bad visuals associated with Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. But also, is this also a matter of concern, the fact that people's power has sort of forced Hong Kong to sort of backtrack on deliberations, at least, on this extradition bill? So is it relief, is it a problem, or is it a bit of both for Beijing?
Well, it's a bit of both. I mean, you touch on some of the points, and of course, this in the case of this increasing confrontation between the United States and China, for example, on all fronts, including human rights in Xinjiang, including South China Sea, and of course the technology and so on and so forth, and even the issues in Hong Kong are being used. So the last thing that Beijing wants to see another fresh point. You also touch on the point about the people power in Hong Kong. Don't forget the so-called umbrella movement. Again, it was a massive kind of resistance in Hong Kong, and then the suspicions that somehow part of the groundswell of opposition is being hijacked by radicals and suspiciously backed by foreign powers. And don't forget that, for example, in this the protest a couple of days ago, there were those radicals in front using appeared to be very well organized. And then there were reports and even higher hooligans at the rate of 2,000 Hong Kong dollars a day to feel more hooligans at the front of the protest, so as to provoke the police to take drastic action, firing tear gas and bullets. So I think that is concern for both Beijing and Hong Kong. But and I think that this kind of realization that pushing through such a controversial bill only raises more suspicions and more opposition, and hence the decision to suspend the reading, not to abandon the bill, but to suspend it, to allow more time for consultations, listen to people's worries, explaining the bill in more detail. And of course, the administration has promised that after the consultation, there will be a report back to the Legislative Council for further views as to how to take it forward.
All right, so we'll wait on and watch on that. To be fair, though, the protests on Sunday were largely peaceful, though we did see a bit of violence on Wednesday. Of course, the story is different depending on whose side you're listening to. We leave it at that. Andrew, KP, Leung, appreciate you joining us this evening and sharing your perspective with us on that story.